afternoon. I'm Robyn Peterson, the director of the Museum of Riverside, which is the steward of Harada House, a National Historic Landmark. We've organized today's session to give you some Inland Empire reflections on the World War II incarceration experience, and I'd like to introduce each of our speakers. Naomi Harada is a descendant of Jukichi and Ken Harada, whose Superior Court victory in 1918 in defiance of California's alien land law led to the designation of the family home in Riverside as a National Historic Landmark. Naomi's father, grandparents, and all other family members alive in 1942 were forcibly removed to the incarceration camps. Judy Lee is a University of California Riverside librarian and is affiliated with the Museum of Riverside in its efforts to open the house to the public and interpret its stories. Shirley Sanematsu's family was also forcibly removed from the Riverside area and is involved with efforts to open Harada House as a site to interpret Japanese American stories from the Inland Empire. Welcome all of you today. Thank you. I'd just like to start, first of all, could I have the next slide? Thank you. I'd like to start with by directing a question to Shirley. Even those who are aware of this chapter in American history may not know that families were broken up when they were sent to the camps, and I believe you can give some examples of some of the reasons for this. Are you muted?
How is this? Is this better?
Yes, that's
great. Okay, sorry if that's, oh, maybe my headphones aren't working. So sorry for that complication. Thanks, Robyn, for the introduction. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. My family, I was born and raised in Riverside, and my grandparents immigrated to California at the turn of the century, late 1800s. My father was the third eldest of six, and he was in his early 20s when the incarceration occurred. They owned a family farm, and my grandfather, being an Issei first-generation immigrant, he was very active with the Los Angeles Buddhist Temple and other various local activities regarding Japanese immigrants. He was taken first, and I think that is something that Robyn was referring to, is families being separated. Many of families whose senior men were Issei and not born in the United States, so were considered immigrant aliens, were taken by the FBI well before the rest of the Japanese community were incarcerated. So according to my family story, he was taken maybe 2 to 3 months before the rest of the family. The FBI came to their home and took him away. And they did not know where he was going. He was ultimately taken to Lordsburg camp, which was the only incarceration camp I've learned that was run by the US Army. And he was there for at least a year, maybe a year and a half, I'm not quite sure, before he was reunited with my grandmother and my father and my 5 aunts and uncles. And they were all interned at in Poston, Arizona. So he was separated from them. They did receive letters from him on occasion that were heavily censored, but the family was not brought back together until at least maybe late 1943 is my understanding.
Thank you. Shirley, could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. Shirley, would you like to continue, comment a little bit about how you know of your parents' and your grandparents' incarceration experience, when that occurred in your own life?
Well, it was, growing up, it was something that was talked about relatively casually at family gatherings. So at Thanksgiving, at Christmas, we would all get together, and I have many cousins, but it was usually talked about in terms of kind of nostalgia, not nostalgic, but as reminiscence of that time. And remember when my father used to work in the cantina, there was a baseball team. They talked about their experience as a time where, certain things happened, but they didn't talk about it in terms of like a violation of their civil rights. They would kind of share their stories, and I would hear about it at the dinner table. about camp. And they would always refer to, oh, remember back at camp. And this yearbook, which is in the slide, is one that my sister now has in her possession, as just one of the kind of many artifacts that, you know, we have still from that time period. I don't recall my grandparents talking about it. It was mostly my aunts and uncles, who ranged in age during that time from junior high to their 20s to mid 20s. My grandparents, I do not recall them talking about it. They may have in Japanese and I just didn't pick up on it. But it was kind of in that context that it was raised to me. And I only learned more about incarceration when I went to college.
Can we have the next slide, please? Okay, Naomi, your family was also split up during the incarceration period, and do you recall why, or do you know why?
Yeah, my grandparents, Jukichi and Ken Harada, were in poor health before the war. My grandmother was half paralyzed from a stroke, and my grandfather had what sounds like congestive heart failure. When the forced removal became imminent, the family decided that it would be best for my grandparents to be with their son, Masaatsu, a physician in Sacramento. So my then 18-year-old father drove his parents in his old Pontiac from Riverside to Sacramento. Auntie Sumi had communicated many times with the Wartime Civil Control Administration and was assured by them that she and my father would be able to join their parents in the same camp when evacuation orders commenced for Riverside. Auntie Sumi and my dad remained in Riverside to negotiate the selling of their restaurant and arrange for the care of their home. However, they weren't sent to the same camp. Auntie Sumi and my father went to Poston, where many of the Inland Empire people went. And Jukichi Ken Masaatsu and his family were sent at first to the Marysville Assembly Center and then to Tule Lake. Upon arrival to Tule Lake, my grandparents were admitted to the camp hospital where they would remain for 118 days. Several requests were made by my aunt and father to transfer to the same camp as their parents. Meanwhile, Masaatsu's medical services were needed in the newly established Topaz Relocation Center. And so his family, my grandparents, were transferred to Topaz. After nearly a year requesting to be joined with their parents, Auntie Sumi and my father were able to leave Poston and transfer to Topaz. My grandmother died a day after their reunion.
Could we have the next slide, please? Shirley, I'd like to return to you, and you made a comment about use the word reminiscence for how your family used to talk about it. Can you share your reflections a little on how little the experience was spoken of and why you think the reasons for that may have been and the tone in which it was spoken of?
Yeah, it only struck me as I learned more about it. And, you know, as a child hearing about them talk about camp and that it was a hardship and there was so much dust in the primitive cabins, not even cabins, but really shacks that were built for people. Those stories were interspersed with things like this photo, which just shows that, you know, life continued once the families were all able to put their accommodations more in order, and that there was actually plumbing installed rather than the open sewage that was there when they initially arrived. Boy Scout troops were started, high schools, junior high and elementary schools started. My uncle and aunt talked about how my eldest uncle taught mathematics. He taught math and science, and my eldest aunt taught home ec with embroidery and needlework and cooking. My father, like I said, worked in the cantina. And so they really normalized it. And it wasn't until I learned more about it in my own studies, of the constitutional violation of their civil rights, being citizens. And this was, with no charges against them. And I pressed them more about that as I got older. And they were very reticent to talk about it in those terms. And I do think part of it, and something that I did hear growing up a lot, is the Japanese term shogunai, which kind of loosely translates to, well, there was nothing you can do about it. So you move on. If there's something that's out of your control, what can you do? So often when I would ask, kind of try to get more probing questions to my father, to my aunts and uncles, there was often a shogunai at the end of whatever they would say, and not really go into more detail about it, what their feelings were about it. And the stories that I heard were really more about their kind of the life they did create while they were in camp, and some of the bonds that they created with other families from Riverside there.
Could we get the next slide, please? Naomi, back to you. Your family is unique in many respects in the Inland Empire Japanese Americans experience, but did you also similarly hear little about the forced removal and incarceration when you were growing up?
I actually heard a fair amount about the forced removal and incarceration. My parents were in their late teens, early 20s during the forced removal, and I would catch little snippets of their experience in the camps, and certain circumstances would trigger memories for them. I remember this is as a little kid. We were traveling through the Mojave Desert, and this horrific dust storm occurred. And my parents immediately said, "Oh, this is like camp," and they then dampened handkerchiefs and bandanas and tied it around our faces so we'd be protected from the dust. Other times, my family, we would be like in downtown LA or at some other Japanese American event, and my father would look at someone and go, "Hey, that guy looks familiar," and he'd go up to them and go, "Oh, were you in Postum, or were you in Topaz, were you in block such and such?" And so it wasn't something that was that was hidden. It was something that was just part of their lives, and they would bring up. My mother would talk about how drafty and windy and cold camp was. She also would occasionally think of things that were gone from her life, like I remember her talking about a maple dining room table. And so unlike my father's family, my mother's family lost everything. I also remember at Auntie Sumi's house, she had this piece of wood that she used as a doorstop, and if you lifted up that piece of wood, it was a lot heavier than the way it looked, and it was a piece of ironwood. And I remember my father saying, "Oh yeah, that's ironwood. That's like what they assaulted and battered your uncle with in Poston." And my father remembered for a long, long time, for decades afterwards, who those assailants were, and would occasionally point them out if he saw them. So the camp experience wasn't something that was hidden from us or our family.
Please. So I'm going to share a couple of slides here, artifacts from the house that you're very familiar with. When did you first see these and learn about their implications?
Yeah,
First,
the calendar I first recall when I was a little kid. I remember it hanging in this laundry room. Um, and there was a sink in the laundry room where we soak the flowers that we're going to take to the cemetery on Memorial Day. And as I got older, I remember that seeing that calendar again there. I really didn't realize its significance, and I just thought that Auntie Sumi had a lot of old stuff in her house, and that was one of the other old things in her house that just didn't change much. As for the inscription on the wall,
yeah, thank you. Yeah, great. Thank you.
okay, so this inscription on the wall, which reads evacuated on May 23rd, 1942, sat at 7 a.m. Shig, which was the nickname for my father. And then it says HHDYI. So this inscription was discovered after Auntie Sumi passed away in 2000. Mark Rawich, the author of The House on Lemon Street, my father, myself, Dana Neitzel, and Kevin Halloran, both of those two, worked for the Riverside Museum, now called the Museum of Riverside. We were all there going over the contents of the house. And so we were up in my father's old bedroom, and it was Mark Rawich who found and pointed out that inscription. My father had forgotten that he had written it, and he looked a bit puzzled and was puzzling, I think, over the initials. And then he remembered. And as I watched this whole process go on, I was like, oh my gosh, the stories, it reified those stories that I had heard about the war in camp. And I think this really brings to mind the necessity and importance of the preservation of historical places. And I also had heard that the assemblyman from the Inland Empire, Jose Medina, when he visited the Harada House, he read that inscription and was very emotionally impacted by this.
Absolutely. Could we have the next slide, please? Judy, we turn to you. I know that the UC Riverside Libraries have some pretty extraordinary resources that illuminate this chapter in Inland Empire experience. Can you comment on the value of these primary records and what's unique about them?
Oh, great. Thanks, Robyn. First, let me provide some context of what we are viewing, and then I'd like to comment briefly about the primary sources. At UC Riverside, we have a set of diaries from the Fujimoto family. Toranosuke, aka George Sr., was the family patriarch and had a farm in North Riverside. He was a diarist of long standing and left diaries written from 1913 to 1968, all written in Japanese. George Jr. wrote in English, and we have his diaries from 1942 to 1968. Now, all of these diaries have been scanned and are freely available from Calisphere. The English language entries have been transcribed in Calisphere as well, and the URL is in the bibliography on our last slide. So, what we see on the screen is George Jr.'s very first entry in his diary, which is Wednesday, March 11, 1942. It reads, "Went to school as usual. Shock at work in packing house." Shock was his older sister, Mabel. "Came home about 5 p.m. and was shocked to learn that Pop was taken into custody by federal officials today. 28 Riverside Japanese aliens were rounded up in today's raid. Mr. Sanematsu and Pop included. Fortunately, Pop was partially prepared." So the Sanematsus and the Fujimotos had farms adjacent to each other. What's not shown on the screen is the entry that George wrote the next day. And he said, stayed out of school today to assume Pop's duties and responsibilities. Went to bank first thing after feeding hens, wet mash to change Pop's, Cha's, and my checking account to mine and Cha's. Successful. Mr. and Mrs. Hiroto paid visit, offered assistance. So even with the catastrophic news, we see that life goes on. The business of the farm had to go on, so they changed the names on the bank account. And the Hiroto visit and offer of assistance illustrates a tight knit and a supportive community in Riverside. Now, I think it would be interesting to compare the diaries of both father and son for that particular entry. I actually found a translation of the elder Fujimoto's diary for that same day on a website called Asian American Riverside. If we have time at the end, or maybe after we finish this discussion, I can read that translation if others would like to hear about it and we can get some more context. But I think we should probably go on with our discussion here.
Please, because this one is the very same day that's inscribed on the wall in Harada House. So the family got split up, and this was partly because people were directed to camps based on where they were at the moment, not necessarily where their families were domiciled. So where did most residents in the Inland Empire go?
Well, as it turned out, this particular evacuation site was similar to many, where everybody who was at that site went to the same camp. In this case, people went to Poston. We've already heard a description from Naomi about why some families would get separated. It's like prior arrangements. If you could do that ahead of time, in her case, it was the health of her grandparents, and so that's basically the reason why people were sent to different places. And what's interesting, in this particular entry, it was written on the day of evacuation, so we have that information. We also have information about what it was like on their arrival at camp and the very first day. Um, it It well, what's not on the screen is also that George wrote, on his second day at camp, this happened, third day of camp, this happened. Now, when the evacuation occurred, people had to leave by buses from Riverside. It occurred on a weekend. So they were evacuated on Saturday, and another set of people were evacuated on Sunday. So by the time the newspaper article showed up on Monday, George was already writing about his, third day in camp in terms of real time of what was happening. But we can see what happened here, and I'm going to go ahead and stop so that we can move on.
Thanks, Judy. Can you go to the next slide, please? And then I want to return to Naomi. That once the Japanese American families were confined to camp, can you explain a little bit about how communication occurred with friends and contacts back home? And we know that many communications were censored, although the many letters from Just Stebler to your Aunt Sumi show few signs of this.
Yeah. Auntie Sumi was a prolific letter writer, and as you've mentioned, one of her correspondents was with Just Stebler. And pretty much most of the content of those letters is fairly mundane, things about the weather, what was blooming in her garden, which fruit trees were ripening, that kind of stuff. I just want to say a little bit about Just Stebler. He was the friend who cared for the Harada House during the incarceration. And there were occasions where he'd drive from Riverside to Poston in his 1927 Cadillac. And during one of those trips, he brought 6 dozen donuts. Additionally, in one of those letters, a little bit different from the usual mundane stuff, was a letter warning her not to return to Riverside alone. So it sounded like things in the community were somewhat dangerous for Auntie Sumi to return there alone, and that she should wait until her brothers were able to return as well.
Please. We've actually got 2 more pages from the Poston yearbook. And Shirley, you've spoken already about how survivors remembered and normalized what they experienced. Do you have any more to share about that?
Well, here's a photo of the home economics class that I'd referenced, just because my Aunt Toshko was the teacher for that course. And I think my younger, I had 2 younger aunts and uncles, and they did not graduate from the high school there, but of course there were some that matriculated from the Poston High School. It's just funny because to hear this, what Naomi and to Judy talk about the Fujimotos, and Naomi to talk about her family's experiences, is how similar, you know, the relations and the discussions that were, the way the stories came out to families is so common. Even Naomi talking about using the sink for the memorial service flowers, and that's where you would soak them before you go to the Olivewood Cemetery in Riverside, which is where many of the Japanese American families have family plots, and we would have memorial services there on Memorial Weekend. Is a tradition that continues. And that the Fujimoto's farm was just around the corner from the Sanematsu farm. And the Fujimotos also had 6 kids, George Jr. and Mabel and Lily. They were contemporaries of my aunts and uncles. And they were like the Haradas. They're Jess Stubler. I don't recall the family name. They had a neighbor. And so my grandparents did not have to sell the farm. The Fujimotos did not sell their farm. They were, the land was maintained. I don't know who paid the property taxes, but when they were finally able to come home, it was there for them. But those experiences of, I would hear Cha and George talk with my father, Arthur, about camp, kind of in passing, because they were neighbors in Riverside. They were in the same structure, same shack in Poston. They lived very close to one another for those 4 years, and did try to just keep on with keeping on while they were in camp.
Yeah, just the yearbook was full of these quite ordinary looking, quite normal life looking social groups that were formed. And the next slide, please. So back to Naomi, the entire direction, as we can well imagine, of incarcerees' lives changed because of camp, which threw people together who otherwise would never have met. And your experience of this is quite direct. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, my parents met in camp. Prior to the war, my mother was a nursing student in San Francisco. So in camp, she worked as a nurse, and my father was an orderly. The story goes that my father's older brother, Masaatsu, thought his younger brother should meet this nurse, and he assisted in circumstances to have that occur. And here I am, tadaima, to share the story.
Next slide, please. So after camp, again, not everybody returned to anything. Well, probably none of the incarcerees returned to anything like their normal life. But can you comment on how the post-camp experience altered the way your Aunt Sumi lived her life?
Yeah, her life changed tremendously. And it's not just the post-camp life, but the forced removal and incarceration greatly altered her life. Her livelihood was gone. Prior to the removal, she ran the family restaurant, the Washington restaurant, and now that was gone. She had been caring for her invalid parents, and they both had died in camp. Gratefully, she had the house, while so many other Nikkei had lost their homes. So when those Nikkei returned to Riverside, Auntie Sumi opened up her home so they would have a place to stay. And in some of the earlier pictures of the Harada House, you could see that there's that enclosed space on the second floor. that used to be an open sleeping porch. So what you're looking into right now used to be entirely open, and she had that enclosed to accommodate some of those returning families. And also later, Auntie Sumi worked as a housekeeper. She cleaned other people's homes.
Slide, please. So this is for the audience sake, this is a message that still is on the bathroom wall, indicating to boarders which towels they should use. And can we go to the next slide now? So just briefly, Judy, we're back to you with a page from George Fujimoto's diary referring to returning. Can you elaborate a little on this?
Right. The image that you see is Monday, June 24th, 1946. And it's actually a few days later than his homecoming. He actually arrived in Riverside at 5 a.m. off the train on Wednesday, June 19th, 1946. His entries generally, his entries for the next few days generally talk about looking over the farm and the town and doing a few chores and having people stop by to visit, especially after the news that he had returned was made known. There were different letters from other people, and he talked about the correspondence that, golly, he would need to write. So in this entry, it reads, "Surprised to get a letter from Toku Okubo. Kayako had him forward a letter to me that came to her from Ohashi-san's daughter of Kyoto. Also, she had a short letter for me. Finding it pretty hard to get back into the old groove. Army life has spoiled me for a good day's work. Cleaning out the storeroom where we left all our junk before going to Poston to make room for Betty when she gets home." So again, it's noting differences, like what has changed in the time being away, and also getting back into life and taking care of things. It turns out that George, I guess after leaving Poston, that he resettled in Des Moines. Then he was drafted and trained by military intelligence to serve as a military translator, and he returned to the Fujimoto farms in 1946. After that, he did take advantage of the GI Bill and went on to college, having applied to the Agricultural College at Davis. And I got that from the website Asian American Riverside. So we can move on.
Yeah, so just a few comments about Harada House to wrap up. The house, this picture was just taken a few months ago. It still stands in its original residential neighborhood, and I just would like to refer back to a comment that Naomi made about the importance of the physical sites and preserving the historic sites because of the immediate, visceral, really emotional experience that is possible to have once you are standing in the place where history happened. And the next slide, please. So this just is a really quick sequence of events that we are working on to get Harada House to the point where the public can have that very type of experience. Working on a plan for rehabilitating the house. You see here, this very fragile structure is braced and shored inside and out, and this is one of the upstairs bedrooms. Fortunately, the Harada family Sumi Harada saved everything, so we have all the furnishings to put back in the house, including the calendar, and the effort will be underway to fundraise for an endowment for the long-term stewardship of the house as a central site for Inland Empire incarceration experiences, as well as the story that gave it its National Historic Landmark status. The final slide, please, shows you some references that relate to the conversation we've had this afternoon. And I do see one. Yes, the very important book by Mark Rawitch. Judy is showing a copy of it, The House on Lemon Street, a very comprehensive and highly readable account of the Harada story. I see a question in the Q&A from Haruka Sabogachi asking Shirley, do you think your family spoke about the camp experiences in a different way when they were among other incarcerees?
Thanks for the question. It's a really good one, and kind of a particular one for me to address, because my family, they were very kind of insular and participated. My father and his siblings were members of the JCL in Riverside, so they socialized in that way. But really, how they spoke with others, when they were with other JA families who'd been incarcerated, I don't recall a difference. And part of that, I think, is because my family generally of that generation, my parents, my father's generation, my aunts and uncles were very conflict averse. And when World War II ended, and I can only think that the incarceration kind of made it even more so, where they, one, didn't want to revisit the controversies of it, and it made them, I think, more introverted themselves. I do remember accompanying my dad to like Bank of America in town, and going into town kind of always made him a little more self-conscious, nervous, that it was not easy for him to do those things, just those daily errands. And when I look back, I think part of that must have been maybe due to the incarceration. But in terms of talking with other families, I heard them talk in these terms of, oh, remember when, Cha, and they would share a funny story. But whenever things became more focused, or when bitterness maybe from someone else would be raised, it was that shogunai attitude of, well, what can you do? And one of my family members would ultimately probably change the topic. So that was maybe particular to the Sanematsus for just being more conflict averse. But yeah, and the conversations that happened in Japanese went over my head. I could pick out some, but not all. And I wish that I could have asked my grandparents more about their thoughts and views, because they definitely were much more quiet about it.
Your family, was there a perceived difference in the way they interacted with other former incarcerees?
Who's the question to?
To you, Naomi.
I'm sorry, I missed the first part.
Yeah, did your experience parallel Shirley's? Was there, or was it different? Did your parents and well, your grandparents had died, but were your parents different among other former incarcerees, or when they experienced, or not? Or did they talk much?
Well, like I said, my father would go up to people who looked familiar and ask them about, their camp experience. So my father was pretty outgoing. And from what I can take, the Haradas were just, maybe we still are, different.
Very outspoken.
Yeah. Auntie Sumi was known for not holding back. She, what she thought you knew about.
Mm-hmm. So there was no real difference in the way she interacted with former incarcerees and other people when the topic came up?
I don't know about Auntie Sumi. I can only speak about my father.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything else any would like to add? I don't see any other questions in the Q&A. If there's any footnotes you'd like to make to comments you made earlier, Judy.
I was just wondering if people might be interested in hearing the translated version of the elder Fujimoto, written on the same day.
Yeah, please.
So, okay, this came from the Asian American Riverside site. Toranosuke Fujimoto was writing from the jail cell. And it's a little bit hard to translate this because I think he wrote in an old-fashioned cursive writing, so there were some parts that are intelligible. Anyway, it goes, "This morning I took care of the chickens and finished breakfast around 8 a.m. Mr. Sakai," and then there's something illegible, "the FBI came and searched the house, taking lots of things. They gathered some of my clothes and took me to jail. Later, Mr. Sakai was brought to jail as well," and then something illegible. And then there appears a list of names, presumably other Issei men also brought in. Hirokawa, Oyama, Matsubara and his children, Masajiro, Shimono, Tsubota, Ishida and his children, Tanaka. "This is the first time I've been in jail. This is a very difficult experience for me. God sent me this experience as a lesson, so I shouldn't complain that this is happening to me. I shouldn't be sad. I should appreciate this precious life that God gave me." And that concludes the entry.
Yeah, I was wondering how many of the families in the Inland Empire were investigated, because I know that my grandparents' house was like totally ransacked by the FBI shortly after Pearl Harbor. So I'm just wondering how widespread that might have been.
I believe that happened to my family's
Yeah.
home too.
Yeah, I've heard that was extremely widespread without necessarily any specific cause.
No. And it's just such a, Judy, thanks for sharing that, because it's just such a heavy passage.
George's diary, his entry indicated 28 Riverside Japanese aliens were rounded up in today's raid. I would assume that's the minimum number that actually happened, because this is what George heard and he reported, but I don't know what the real numbers were.
And then it progressed for days after that. Yeah, weeks after that.
Yeah. I mean, I guess there's a kind of a separate point that I in kind of getting ready for today, and talking with my siblings about what they remembered, and they reminded me, my sister reminded me that there were my father and an aunt both left camp during the war, taking these openings that were made available to adults who wanted to go to the interior or to the East Coast to either work, because of course with the war going on, there was a shortage of workers, or to go to school. And so one of my aunts went to Drexel University for a year to study music. And my father, with Charles Fujimoto, George's younger brother, they were very close friends, convinced both of their dads, my grandfather and George Sr., to let them go to Iowa to learn the trade of chick sexing, because both families had hens and supplied the local Safeway with eggs before the war. And so they went to a chick sexing school. My father did not like it. He didn't like, I think he got a bit, missed the family and came back. Charles stayed on. I don't know for how long, but there were those kind of instances where either if a man wanted to join the army or could sign up, and also these other chances where they could get permission to leave, as long as it was to the interior. So I know that was the experience of some of my family members.
Right. Similarly, my mother was able to leave camp. And from my understanding, you had to have somebody sponsor you to be able to leave camp. And have some sort of either job or school. So she was able to get into a nursing school in New York. And she also had a sponsor, so she worked as a nanny while going to nursing school, and that was her way out.
Mm-hmm.
So Mineo Kubo, who is a Riverside native, that's what happened when she left Topaz. She had a job offer from a publisher in New York City, so she left to go work for that publisher. And I think she basically moved to New York and really never left New York after that. So, it just depends on what the opportunities were.
Yeah, another question from the same questioner. Were many families in the Inland Empire able to return to their homes after incarceration? And I know the Harada story is quite unique in that respect. And Shirley, you've mentioned that your family did not lose the farm. What do you know about other JA families from the Inland Empire? Any of you?
Yeah, we're just disproportionately represented here as the exceptions. I think the majority of families did not have properties to come back to. People hear about it more from, I think, families who were incarcerated at Manzanar in Los Angeles, from the Los Angeles area. Maybe property values were higher, or they did not have the same maybe family supports, or because it was whole swaths of the community. In Riverside, I think the J community, my understanding, the Sanematsus and Fujimotos had adjoining very close properties to one another. The Haradas were closer to town, to the city center. There were other Japanese American families, in other parts of Riverside. So it wasn't as concentrated at that time. But I think it's just the Haradas and the Sanematsus and the Fujimotos actually were the exceptions to the rule in being able to come back to their family properties.
Um,
Oh, sorry.
I was just going to say, I don't know exactly how many different family members stayed at Auntie Sumi's after the war, but I would say maybe 10 or so. And I don't know after once they stayed there if they stayed in Riverside itself.
And they took up the offer to board there because they had lost their homes. Yeah.
Correct.
Mm-hmm. Judy?
And I'm sorry, Robyn, maybe you can help me with this because I can't remember the name of the family, but I think in the house on Lemon Street, I mean, we're talking about sometimes it's a matter of choice of not going back too. So I think Harold was able to meet up with somebody who was from Riverside when he was fighting in the 442nd, and that son also fought. And I'm sorry, the last name I think starts with a T.
Teshima.
And
Teshima.
yes, so apparently that son did not make it. And so after the war, when they came back, it was really one of the brothers who came to Sumi's house and presented her with a package, which she put in a place to keep but didn't open. And the person said goodbye. But basically, that family decided not to come back because maybe they felt starting over again in another new place was better, and other circumstances led them to going to the other place. And so the brother who brought that package back it was just sort of like a final goodbye. And inside that package, which was not unwrapped until many years later, with Mark Rawich being there, showed the flag that was presented to the family on that son's death, and um, two carp, the carp that were used to celebrate Boys' Days, and basically one for each male child. So I think there were two, and I think those are part of the museum's collections now. So please tell me if I misremembered that or not.
No, that's correct.
Yes, that is correct. And thanks for bringing it up.
It's
very
Teshima,
relevant.
right? Yeah.
Yes.
No, so if I may segue, so back to the question about primary resources, we talked about diaries, and the oral histories right now are what we are sharing, stories and remembrances from people who are direct descendants. But there's a lot of other things that are affiliated with primary sources, and many things are being digitized and scanned, and from diaries to photos and such. And there are great progress and strides being made. And so I would like to point out that what we're striving for with the Harada House project is not only to have a place, because a place sort of grounds people as to this was there, this is real, and to have that visceral, you are there impact, like reading Harold's inscription, penciled inscription, when it goes back onto the wall, and you get the context of it, and really that's you are there. But there's so many other items that are part of the Harada family archives, from realia to written letters, to all sorts of things that reflect the era. And some of that is going to go back into the house. Others will remain as part of the museum's collections. And there's a lot of opportunity for research, really to get that context of what happened in a family's life, some of the mundane everyday things, some of the impacts of the calamity that had happened and how that just ripped up people's lives. So there's a lot of work that can be done. And so I think if any of you out there have materials that were from your families, and you're thinking, oh, we're not going to keep this, it would be a good idea to present those materials to share with the future, and maybe more knowledge and more understanding, hopefully, can be uncovered, and the stories will make a difference to our children and people in the future.
Very well said. Thank you. Well, I don't see any other questions from the audience, but I do want to thank all of our panelists and all of you in the audience for joining us this afternoon for this discussion. There are many other stories like this out there, and I hope you will do your part to preserve them, find them, and discuss with others.
Sorry, could I just say one more thing? I
Sure.
would like to express my gratitude to the people at Tadaima for bringing all of us together to be able to share these stories with each other, because the more we know, and hopefully we'll get better understanding.
Absolutely right. Thank you.